I am going to attempt to live the American dream.
A home that costs just $9,000.
Average sales price is $345.
A place of our own, not cramped in a dingy little apartment.
Owning my own house.
Proudly say, this is my home.
That one looks a little bit out of my price range. Yeah.
The high end, the only tier seeing supply gains.
All right, this one looks quite a bit more modest, and being farther out, $469,000. I'll never afford a house.
The economic well-being of the American citizens.
People are overextended. They're spending more than they bring in.
Probably one bedroom or so. Yikes, I'm not affording that.
The typical American home, which is available to our average worker at a cost equal to 6,000 work hours. 6,000 work hours.
For a starter house? Okay, I've got to drive really far out there. This neighborhood has fallen, hopefully right into my price range. Gosh, even in this neighborhood.
More fun, more leisure.
The American dream seems to be glitching. But what if I told you before this American dream, there was another American dream, and we broke that one too?
I suppose the American dream is prosperity. Thomas Jefferson was pretty excited about the idea of the yeoman farmer, being able to one day own land that you work yourself, deed in hand, soil between your fingernails, and make money from the profit of your labors. When we think about the 19th century, we imagine people working really hard without any government assistance. But it actually isn't quite true. One of the biggest government giveaways in American history took place right after the Civil War. When Thomas Jefferson was president, he more than doubled the size of the country, and Northerners and Southerners were split on what to do with all this land. If you talk to a Southerner, he imagined expanding plantations out into the West, something that the North wasn't too excited about. They didn't want to see slavery expanded, they wanted to get rid of it. So they proposed instead just giving the land away to people to farm. But that would mean more states that are free states against slavery and could make it illegal. The idea of homesteading land took until after the Civil War. But the Homestead Acts of 1862 and 1866 changed everything. 160 acres of rich American soil that you could farm yourself. All you had to do is pay $18 to apply, live on the land for 5 years while you farm it and build a house, and on the 7th year, the government would give you the deed. And this wasn't just for white men, this was also for freed African Americans, for women, even immigrants who had every intention of becoming a U.S. citizen. And a huge private transportation investment made it possible. Steel wheels a-rolling, the railroad.
During this era, the U.S. and Canadian railroads finally agreed on a gauge. You know how wide the track should be? That way, all the trains could use all the track. And that allowed the amount of railroad in this country to explode.
And the Transcontinental Railroad was the backbone of all of it.
Now you didn't have to wait months for wagon trains to bring your supplies out to your farm. They could come on the train in just a matter of days. And if you had extra crops to sell, you could throw them on the train and sell to a much larger market.
Between the railroad and the Homestead Act, America boomed. To help make the process of settling claims a bit more orderly, Congress paid to survey the entire West.
The public land survey system chopped everything up into nice, perfect north, south, east, west blocks.
And it's also why you have towns named Meridian, Idaho, named after one of the north-south survey lines, and Baseline, named after an east-west survey line.
The legacy of this is all over the West. You're not going to run the road down the middle of somebody's property, so you put them right along the edge of survey blocks. Look at Phoenix. Those blocks are perfect. Everything a perfect mile square. Whoever surveyed Las Vegas did a really sloppy job, and the roads are crooked forever. Texas didn't participate in the public land survey system, and it shows. Yeah.
But the American dream always has its rough edges, and the homesteading era definitely did too. You remember how I said this was open to everyone?
At the end of the war, General Sherman wanted to give every freed slave 40 acres and a mule. President Lincoln loved the idea of using farming to get people on their feet economically. But Lincoln got shot, and President Andrew Johnson, he turned the policy around. Freed slaves were generally penniless. they had no money to travel west to claim land. And even if they could, they didn't have the $18 to apply. The Southern Homestead Act hoped to fix some of that problem by allowing African Americans to claim land right near where they lived. But with all the barriers white Southerners threw up after the war, which made daily life a pain, it's no surprise that out of the 28,000 people who claimed land under the Southern Homestead Act, only about 4,000 were African Americans.
And like so many times in American history, Native Americans came out on the short end of this too. President Andrew Jackson forced thousands of indigenous people to move to Oklahoma. And the problem was America was allowing people to homestead lands the government had promised to these Native Americans. By the 1880s and 1890s, a lot of the good farmland had been claimed already. Farmers still wanting to get a fresh start, or the children of farmers who wanted to own their own farms, had to move farther and farther west into land that was a little more marginal. The soil wasn't as good, the water, the rainfall wasn't as frequent. But these young farmers were eager to put themselves in danger and take on the risk because the long-term benefits would be worth it. But there was just so much fever to keep this American dream going, even though it was making less and less sense every year. Investors on Wall Street had put so much money investing into railroads that they actually overspeculated and crashed the market. One of these marginal areas that was really hotly farmed was those panhandles of Texas and Oklahoma. A lot of people moved out there, found there was still plenty of rain, so they started planting and growing crops just like they would in Ohio or Louisiana or anywhere else. The trouble was, that region was in a 30-year wet spell, and farmers convinced themselves that God looked down from heaven and saw their labor and said, you know what, let's give them some rain. The rain follows the plow. Now, of course, scientifically, we know that's a myth. And they found out when it suddenly shifted from unseasonably wet to unseasonably dry. These farmers who were not planting anything to protect their topsoil watched it all blow away 3 times during the 1930s, which was already an awesome decade. Thousands of farmers lost their jobs. This whole Dust Bowl era really was kind of the end of the old American dream. Diesel-powered tractors were really cutting down on the number of farmers America needed to grow crops, and as those tractors started pushing farmers off the land, conveyor belts started pulling people into the city.
I know that my kind of a life, it ain't very high.
Industrialization required synergy. Not only do workers all gather at a single place, factories themselves needed to be near raw materials, parts, shipping, sources of power, and Americans' ability to make money was now centralized, which meant everyone piling on top of one another for a centralized place to live.
You couldn't continue to live out in the country where you had a 2-hour walk to the factory, so you moved to the city. And that made cities very crowded. Industrialization created a best of times for those who owned a factory. Those who worked for the factory, it was sort of the worst of times. Oftentimes 12 families or more overcrowding a single floor of a tenement, sharing a single lavatory, each family displaced from agriculture, raising kids in these filthy cities because it's frankly all they can afford. In 1890, journalist Jacob Riis started documenting society's other half. Riis wrote, "Long ago it was said, one half of the world does not know how the other half lives. It did not know because it did not care. In New York, that time came later. There were those who believed it would never come. Today, 3/4 of its people live in the tenements. The story is dark enough to send a chill to any heart. What are you going to do about it?"
Not cramped in a dingy little apartment, a place of our own.
But as awful as city life was, it still really was the place to be when there are no farm jobs. People were still continuing to move for opportunity and for work. The old American dream had broken. Urban planners of the 1910s and 1920s started thinking, people need access to the city for its opportunities. They don't necessarily need to live there, not if there's a piece of equipment, some piece of technology that could move them in and out of the city each day. I wonder what that could be.
As molded to our human wants, new cities take form, green cities. They're ringed with trees and fields and gardens. New cities are not allowed to grow and overcrowd beyond the size that makes them fit for living in. The new city is organized to make cooperation possible between machines and men and nature.
It was a great idea that was put on hold because of one little crisis.
America goes to war. Reinforce the battlefronts on 6 continents.
World War II. All development stopped at that point. But like all crises, World War II didn't last forever, and now you had an army of GIs coming home who wanted to buy houses and one of the biggest housing shortages in American history.
And they were thinking about how they wanted to live and where.
From Los Angeles, more music.
The high tomorrow, 82. Light smog maybe for the megalopolis. At the beaches now 72. Valley 82. Downtown 76. Orange County 75.
They had seen the Autobahns of Germany, privates, captains, and generals, now trading their stripes for suits. And as the new mayors, governors, and presidents, they thought these superhighways would be just perfect to move people around within America's new suburbs. And the crown jewel, the interstate highway system,
which President Eisenhower signed into effect in the 1950s. Affordable, quality homes in just a few minutes' drive from city cores. It worked great for white Americans who qualified.
Back in the 1950s and 60s, banks would refuse to lend to certain types of buyers or in certain types of neighborhoods, their argument being certain loans were too risky. But let's be honest, it was just straight up racism. Even in suburbanization's golden era, this discriminatory practice hung over like a storm cloud.
We all know that the roots of injustice run deep. Fair housing for all is now a part of the American way of life. The time is here. Action must be now.
Of course, price is a huge barrier in trying to get everybody of all backgrounds into suburban life. How did houses become so expensive? We can blame some of it on all the zoning restrictions we put in place. Suburbs, by design, have strict rules to prevent them from turning back into the urban tenements that they replaced. One house per lot, more than half the lot has to be green space.
There really were some pretty sweet development sites near job centers. You had beaches and mountains and all kinds of places people wanted to live, and they were close to work. The problem with mandating single-family zoning is that you do still run out of land. By the 1980s and 90s, a lot of those sites had gotten tapped out. And you can't tear down any of the old houses to up the density.
It starts messing with the supply and demand curve. Some of the biggest middle-class generations in human history buying houses, increasing demand, and supply struggling to keep up.
You got to put people someplace. Well, you know, it is a floodplain, but it only floods once every 100 years. Yeah, it's wildfire country, but, you know, we've got a fire department. Originally, people were moving out here because they wanted to be able to afford a bigger house, but eventually it became people moving all the way out here because it was the only house they could afford to buy.
And the latest incident in the Rush Hour Rodeo is on the eastbound Pomona. It's moving in slow motion up to the Long Beach area.
Boy, it sounds busy this morning.
Busy Monday, that's for sure.
If you don't go the minute the light changes, people start honking their horns.
So we start from 10 to 210, and from the 134 we get on the 5. Spends an average of 4 hours a day.
Not only are people driving past their neighborhoods, they're driving past everybody else's neighborhoods, and everybody combines together over time.
A top state leader floated the idea of a double-decker I-15.
Double in population. The only option is up.
Be prepared for big changes on I-70. Will be widening.
$1.8 billion.
A billion-dollar makeover could help.
The valley's grown tremendously. I-10 is continually congested.
One lane is not enough.
It's too congested. Too many people live in Miami.
They don't make any new land. Houses only go up in value. That myth made people take chances on stuff that didn't make sense. Yes, I know I'm paying over half my paycheck on the mortgage, but the houses will keep going up in price. If we get in trouble, we can sell it.
A few years ago, new homes were sprouting up like the crops that surround them.
What fed all this, of course, was Wall Street's eagerness to create more mortgage-backed securities, and loan processors were eager to initiate new loans, and builders were excited to build.
You know, we've never been here before. The Treasury's never been here before.
Poor judgment and poor market practices led to mistakes by all participants.
The yeas are 263. The motion is adopted.
We tend to think we built too many houses in 2008. The problem was the areas people needed to be living in were built out. So we were writing mortgages in places like Stockton and Modesto. Real people moved into these houses that they couldn't afford. The problem wasn't that there was too many houses, it was the couldn't afford part. The demand was still real. Since the 1970s, California's done a much better job growing its economy than growing its housing stock. The state's about 3.5 million housing units short. And there are weird symptoms which show it. Have you ever noticed how in single-family neighborhoods in California, all the on-street parking is taken? That's because the existing housing stock is overcrowded. And with more people living in the house and fewer houses to go around, rent prices and mortgage prices go up. And high prices also have an effect that pushes California license plates right over the border into your state, which grows the population of where you live, increases the demand for housing, and the entire cycle starts again, just on a smaller level.
Not in my backyard.
A bitter battle between a developer and a neighborhood.
300 housing units.
Tampa residents now taking on city council.
Traffic issues. Traffic.
Heavy trucks.
Traffic.
Cars.
Traffic.
Traffic. Traffic. Traffic. Traffic.
Traffic.
A disaster.
Why are we putting 1,500 houses instead of 500?
The environmental impact.
Environmentalists concerned.
Destroy the ecology.
Nature, they tear it.
Environmental impacts. Sensitive chaparral.
The Sierra Club opposes. Neighbors are not happy.
I'm against it.
We're fighting it all the way.
We do not want this.
Crime.
They're afraid it will ruin the feel of their neighborhood.
The rustic, ranch-like,
unique neighborhoods.
I'm not going to value my property when it's that close.
Property value won't be a good fit.
Not happy with the proposed plan to build condos.
We don't want it to be ruined.
The apartment complex just isn't fit for this area.
I am not satisfied.
It's definitely going to be much worse.
An eyesore.
Wreck the character of the neighborhood.
20 homes across my front yard. And we deserve everything possible done to protect our property.
Signed a petition against it.
Neighbors have been submitting their opposition.
The people who live there tell us they will submit a petition. They plan to attend meetings that could determine the future of this process.
A federal court says no more than 500 residences.
Take it all the way to the ballot.
They would be better off stopping the development.
Development needs to stop.
We'd rather see not any development done.
There is such a wide variety of architectural styles and floor plans that the buyer can usually find exactly what suits him best in the location where he wants to live.
Southern California's
KFI. The streets are empty. That are usually bumper to bumper.
Shortly after the pandemic broke out, I went for a late-night drive on the LA freeways. Never empty, even in the middle of the night. And it got me thinking, the pandemic may create a new American dream that could solve all these failures. And for more on that, check out my previous video by clicking right here. Doing the same job at work that they would have been doing at home. If 1/3 of Americans could permanently work from home, that changes transportation planning in a huge way. Freeways generally fail during morning and afternoon rush hour as everybody's trying to drive to work.